Happy Friday, everyone. It's Rod with Power Group. Welcome back on The Pursuit of Wealth, your home for MJ Stocks, crypto assets, and interviews. With me again is Morgan Fox, Political Director at NORML. Morgan, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Just so everybody's aware as well, Morgan was having some issues with his camera. He wasn't in his regular setup, but we keep the show going rain or shine. So we wanted to, I know a lot of people are excited about this, myself included, to get an update right from the horse's mouth, so to speak. But I've already done an interview with you in the past, so we'll kind of jump right to it. If anybody does want to learn more about yourself, you can check out my original interview. But I was very excited to speak with you today. There's a lot going on lately, to say the least, in the cannabis space, and it's hard to believe it's been a little over a year since we last spoke.
Yeah, it's been a pretty busy year. Lots of action, although unfortunately not a lot has crossed the finish line at the federal level yet. We're definitely seeing growing momentum for both large scale and incremental legislation gaining traction over the coming months.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that might be a good starting point, actually. Just to get things kicked off, could you give us a rundown on the current cannabis bills that are moving through Congress? There's a lot going on. I know Don Murphy recently announced a historic House win after the CURE Act passed in what he believed to be the first standalone bill for cannabis-related bill, and it passed a Republican-controlled chamber yesterday. So that was great to see. He also mentioned that he had another GOP senator in the yay column for safe banking. And then there's also other bills like SAFER, the MORE Act, which was resubmitted yesterday as well. So lots going on, to say the least. Could you just give us an update on that, where NORML stands on these bills?
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the CURE Act, I worked pretty heavily with the Democratic sponsor on this bill. We were pleasantly surprised to see that Chairman Comer of the Oversight Committee was interested in fast-tracking the legislation through a markup in oversight. And unfortunately, the only way that it was going to move was if the language regarding current cannabis use was stripped out, as well as the potential for people who had been denied employment or security clearances in the past was removed. That being said, the bill that was approved in a 30-14 vote, a huge bipartisan landslide, will protect people from being discriminated against for past cannabis use up until, I'm assuming, the point of when they're asked that question in the hiring process. A number of states have already done this in terms of preventing pre-employment drug testing for state positions, and in some cases for all employers. We were really happy to see that pass through committee, and hopefully it will be moving its way to the floor in short order. I think that it was really telling that an amendment offered by Pete Sessions, who's a longtime cannabis policy reform opponent, was shut down pretty heavily. This offered amendment would have made the window within which cannabis can be used to deny employment or security clearances 3 years from the date of application. And one of the great parts of that hearing was that the Republican sponsor of the bill, Nancy Mace, basically said that the idea of considering any cannabis use within the past 3 years as current use was laughable. Which I think was completely accurate. While this isn't the first cannabis policy reform standalone to move through Congress, because last session we saw a research bill get approved by both chambers and the president, it was the first time a standalone bill had gotten a markup in the House for this particular session.
Right.
So that's definitely a very good sign. The amount of bipartisan support behind it was very solid. So I'm very excited about the possibility of that bill being able to pass through the House and then be introduced in the Senate, potentially beefed up and strengthened to something closer to its original version. But even without that, not denying people the ability to serve their country through federal employment or national security sensitive positions just because they may have used cannabis in the past, like half of all Americans have, I think is a really big step and a sign that Congress is starting to soften on this issue, as well as recognize that there are a lot of people legally using cannabis now. Not to mention the fact that there are so many unregulated CBD products out there that may end up causing somebody to test positive on a test for THC, and that sometimes that can potentially jeopardize employment as well. So really looking forward to that going forward. And as I'm sure you and your listeners know, on Wednesday, the 27th, we're going to get a markup in the Senate Banking Committee on the newly introduced Safer Banking Act. This is, for the most part, functionally identical to the original Safe Banking Act that the Senate was considering. It basically embodies some issues that members of the Senate Banking Committee have had and represents the compromises that they've worked out so that when it goes to markup on Wednesday, they're not going to have to deal with dozens of different amendments. So functionally, it's still pretty much the same. In terms of regulators' abilities to continue to monitor potential activity related to money laundering or funneling funds to transnational criminal organizations or terrorist organizations, that language has been beefed up a little bit. There's a lot more language that is specifically designed to ensure fair access, particularly for small businesses and those owned by representatives of marginalized communities. So I think that this new bill really represents an excellent compromise that I'm hopeful will be able to make it through the markup hearing with an overwhelming majority support. At which point, we'll move to the judiciary, and Senate leadership has been very, very vocal about their to connect the HOPE Act, which would provide federal funding for state level and local level expungement efforts, as well as the Graham Act, which would protect Second Amendment rights for lawful cannabis consumers in that committee. And then from there, we would hopefully get to a floor vote in a relatively short order. I think it's important that these things move pretty quickly at this point in time because we are rapidly approaching election season and we're dealing with all sorts of issues regarding funding the government. Unfortunately, in situations like that, cannabis policy reform can oftentimes fall by the wayside because it's still not considered a priority issue for most lawmakers, with the exception of some of our champions. That's starting to change as lawmakers hear from their constituents more and more about their need to act on cannabis policy reform legislation as quickly as possible and that they should hold it as a priority. But we still got a long way to go in that regard.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, thanks for that. Lots to unpack there. And yeah, ever since, August recess coming back, it seems like the atmosphere has been has changed quite a bit. It's been pretty cannabis focused based on everything that you just said. So
we also saw the reintroduction of the MORE Act this week. This is large-scale comprehensive legislation to remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act and also provide for expungement of past records. There are a number of other benefits to this legislation, and it's already been approved as written twice by the House, largely along party lines. But we're also anticipating the introduction of several other kind of broader measures in the coming weeks. Potentially the States Reform Act and the States Act on the Republican side. We're also looking at a lot of cannabis-related issues coming up in appropriations bills as they move through both chambers of Congress. I think that the period of debate over those is probably going to be extended because of either a government shutdown or the passage of a continuing resolution to keep funding the government, which would, for the most part, keep funding levels and policies relatively the same. But at least when it comes to cannabis issues. But I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to get language into the spending bills this year that include things like allowing VA doctors to be able to recommend cannabis to their patients under the auspices of relevant state laws, to be able to protect both people seeking security clearances as well as federal employment from being drug tested, to improve research. And I think that the real goal for this appropriations, for me at least, is to get language approved that prevents the Department of Justice from interfering with state adult use programs. Since 2014, Congress has included language in appropriations bills that prevents DOJ from going after state legal medical programs. And we'd like to see that extended to the adult use programs that currently exist in 23 states, as well as DC and several territories.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. Well, yeah, it definitely seems now that, I guess you could say that the C-19 era is sort of behind us at this point. And while, cannabis was sort of on the back burner, it seems to be that, like I said, the narrative's changed a lot since then and seems to be more at the forefront, would you say?
We're definitely seeing a lot more action than we have in the past. We're seeing a lot more support than we have in the past on both sides of the aisle. It's still not a top priority issue, but I think that there are enough people in Congress right now that are invested in the issue, but also are recognizing that voters want to see Congress be able to pass some laws that benefit them. And cannabis policy reform is one of those areas that does enjoy bipartisan support and is something that can get done in this session, despite all of the the partisan rancor that's going on around other issues. My main concern is actually finding the time to get these pieces of legislation onto the committee schedules and get them to the floor of either chamber when there's all these distractions happening.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, we touched on it a little bit so far, but yeah, with everything that's been going on, tons of stuff going on. And would you say that a lot of the enthusiasm for these cannabis bills were sort of sparked by, the research bill, the Biden administration, and then also calling on HHS to review the classification of the drug? As we know, it's on Schedule 1, and HHS is recommending that they reschedule cannabis to Schedule 3. How monumental would you say this is for the cannabis industry, and is this enough? Do we need more?
Well, the fact that HHS recommended a move to Schedule 3, and by the way, nobody has seen exactly what that recommendation looks like. Nobody that I've spoken with has seen the letter, including a number of lawmakers in the Cannabis Caucus, and several of my colleagues have tried to use Freedom of Information Act requests to get the actual letter and have been denied. So without knowing exactly what HHS has been recommending, it's kind of difficult to really say what the DEA specifically is going to be looking at. But we know historically that the DEA has taken a really long time to review these petitions, and uniformly, even as recently as 2016, has recommended that cannabis stay in Schedule 1. The fact that the administration is putting its force behind this change, although not as strongly as we would like, I think could potentially lead to faster DEA action. At the same token, at a time when House and Senate Republicans are going after the administration for quote unquote weaponizing federal agencies, the idea of putting pressure on a federal agency to fast track anything, especially something that might help his election, could be potentially problematic. So it could go either way. The fact of the matter is that we don't have any precedent for any of this. And so it's very difficult to say exactly what will happen. What we do know is that a move to Schedule 3 is simply not enough. We need to remove cannabis from the schedule of controlled substances. Schedule 3 could have some benefits for taxation for cannabis businesses, could ease some restrictions on research, but by and large, it would not end the federal conflict or the conflict between federal and state laws. It certainly would not decriminalize cannabis at the federal level. It wouldn't really do anything for consumers. And I think that it's still going to be incumbent upon Congress to actually do the real heavy lifting and remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act altogether and develop a regulatory framework that both respects state laws while providing guidance and best practices to state programs.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great insight. And yeah, just me being a technical analyst, I know that's probably not in your wheelhouse, but just taking a look for, and kind of speaking to our retail investors, and I am one, it looks like the charts are getting primed for an imminent rally into the end of the year here. I would say over the next 1 to 2 months. I've been on record to say that I believe that the DEA will come back with a recommendation at some point over the next month or two, just based on what the charts are saying. But like I said, it looks like we could see a massive run into the end of the year. And I know a lot of people are waiting for that. And, with respect to what you said about taxation, if you've ever seen Boris Jordan, the co-founder and executive chairman of Curaleaf, he said that they've already paid over $350 million to the U.S. government under that tax code alone. And if it weren't for that tax code, they would already be paying a dividend more than likely. That was straight from his mouth. So just kind of gives you an idea of what Schedule 3 would mean. But like you say, it really only benefits the multi-state operators and the operators in the U.S. who are being hindered by that 280E tax burden, right?
Well, I mean, I want to reiterate something that I believe I said the last time I was on here, was that investors really need to know that this is a long, drawn-out process. And just because we're getting hearings does not mean that you should be mortgaging your house again to be able to invest in the cannabis industry. I honestly think that there are a lot of companies and a lot of investment funds out there that are frankly selling investors a bill of goods that is not going to come to pass. And this is a long game. Investing in the cannabis industry is great, but you should expect for it to take a long time before you actually start seeing dividends. So I would recommend not putting yourself in a position where you're going to be, potentially hurt financially if there isn't a sudden miracle, basically. And even if these laws pass, we're going to continue to see stocks fluctuating. We're going to continue to see probably huge jumps upon the news of this, and then huge drops again as the actual policy implications start to settle out. So it's something that I would recommend people really look at in terms of a long-term investment plan, as opposed to any sort of quick turnaround. I would also recommend looking at other options besides just what's available in terms of the publicly listed companies and ETFs, especially if you can find ways to make microloans to smaller businesses that honestly need that capital way more than the larger companies, and could help to diversify and increase competition within the cannabis industry itself, which is going to benefit consumers as well as investors, as well as the businesses themselves, forcing them to pursue innovation, streamline their operations, and operate more intelligently within the markets that they operate. And so I urge caution. Also, and I mean, this is going to sound self-serving, but if you really want to invest in cannabis, I think that the first thing you should be thinking about is investing in cannabis policy reform.
Yeah, I concur. That's a great point. And I do recall you speaking about that last time we chatted. And if anybody hasn't seen the original interview, you can go back to my playlist. I do have an interview playlist with Morgan, and that was a little bit more introductory to what NORML is as well. But yeah, absolutely. And moreover, on that point, this isn't financial advice. This isn't to be taken as such. And this is just for informational and entertainment purposes only. And by the way, I have no affiliation to NORML, in case I know someone's going to ask that. I have donated to NORML in the past, and we'll discuss here toward the end about how you can do so as well for our listeners who are tuning in after the fact. But I did mention to a lot of my audience that I expected the most likely scenario was going to be we get some sort of rescheduling news that would knock us out of this multi-year bear market and start a multi-year bull market. I thought that was the catalyst, like the most realistic, but also, and having realistic expectations, I think is a lot to do with what investors are lacking, and just patience. Obviously, it's hard to do when you're getting this much investor fatigue, and the market's designed to make you feel some type of way. But as long as you have realistic expectations, and I figured that Schedule 3 would be the most likely scenario. But then I said, watch for there to be opposition, right? Nothing's going to go straight up in a straight line or straight down forever. It's going to ebb and flow, right? And then sure enough, there was 14 GOPs were in opposition. And then I just saw an article today that 2 key Republican senators sponsoring cannabis banking reform are now pushing new legislation to thwart the Biden administration's historic MJ efforts. So Cynthia Lummis and Steve Daines on Thursday today introduced the Deferring Executive Authority Act, the DEA Act. So again, kind of goes in line with what I was saying. There's going to be some turbulence, right, as we get developments, and there's always going to be, both sides of the aisle, people who are for and against. But what are your thoughts on that DEA Act to potentially block that?
Well, it's interesting because, I've always been of the opinion that major scheduling change is going to originate in Congress anyway. I think that some of the statements made by Senator Loomis are a little bit nonsensical because Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, and the whole rescheduling and descheduling process was already passed by Congress. So, I mean, they at the time placed that authority within, created that scheduling review structure. So, honestly, in terms of this legislation, I'm not sure that I see it moving in any quick fashion. I think it may also be kind of part of the larger narrative about the partisan divide over exactly how federal agencies operate, completely unrelated to cannabis. But it's important to remember that Steve Daines has been an absolute champion and a rock star on safe banking, but he does not support legalization personally.
Right.
So I think that it's important to look at it through that lens. So like anything else in politics, it creates very strange bedfellows, and I think that it's really important when anybody is working with lawmakers at the federal level or even at the state and local level to try to find the areas where you can agree on and work on those, and any other disagreements that you have, cross those bridges when you come to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. No, well, just cross our fingers, I guess, at this point, and just take it one step at a time, like you said. And then I recently did a video. I'm not sure how much you can. I know you don't have a crystal ball, but just curious what your thoughts are. I recently published a video on how multi-state operators and the operators in the U.S. would benefit more than licensed producers here in Canada from Schedule III recommendation. Obviously, with the Canadian names being listed on U.S. major exchanges like the NASDAQ, it's going to still open up more opportunity because of the hype, right, and enthusiasm, and that's going to be what a lot of retail investors have access to. But do you believe that the DEA will sign off on this recommendation of Schedule 3, or do you think they'll push for Schedule 2 descheduling? What do you think is the most likely scenario there?
Honestly, I think it's impossible to tell at this point, and I would caution any of your viewers who are hearing anybody say they know exactly what's going to happen to really look at that skeptically. The simple fact is that there's zero precedent for any of this.
Right. Definitely. Yeah, as long as you have realistic, it goes back to what I say, right? Have realistic expectations, be prepared to, if it's money that if you're putting your rent money or something like that as a retail investor into this space, well, if it's money that you need, you're probably going to be let down, right? It's probably going to be, 3, 5 plus 10 years, plus years out that we really start to see some, critical mass type of thing in the MJ space. And just as long as you don't invest any more than you're willing to lose, and you have that long-term mindset, right?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think that it's also important to think about the fact that even a move to Schedule 3 does not end the conflict between state and federal laws in the United States. So the question is, and it's a completely open question, is how much are federal agencies going to enforce the protocols that are applicable to Schedule 3 to cannabis? Technically, these cannabis would have to be approved by the FDA in order to bring any of these programs into compliance. But in that case, every single dispensary would have to become a pharmacy. And everybody that wanted to use it, adult use or medical, would have to get a prescription from a doctor. That's just completely unworkable from the state's perspective. And the idea of the FDA being able to approve whole plant cannabis as a drug is also unprecedented.
Right.
And they would eventually have to, I think that there would be serious IP issues involved, especially when you would have to get more or less every single genotype of cannabis approved. And in order to do that, the general FDA approval process for a drug costs like tens to hundreds of millions of dollars and several years. We would be looking at, in order to make state programs into compliance with Schedule 3 would require a complete overhaul and probably 10 years of research and applications to actually get that done.
Wow. Yeah, that kind of, let that sink in for people, right? It's not as clear cut and straightforward as many people think. I know it's easy to get frustrated and whatnot when, things are kind of going sideways or just continuing down, but we can definitely see light at the end of the tunnel. And I definitely feel that this time's different, but yeah, not telling anybody that, we know for sure, right? It's just a matter of, one step at a time. And as long as you have realistic expectations and you're not, like you say, mortgaging your house or investing any more than you're willing to lose, it's money you can let sit. I see, tons of people, putting in way more, stretching themselves way beyond what they should be. And I think that has a lot to do with, the fact that people are getting impatient as well and just overall emotional, because they probably broke the golden rule, right? But you mentioned that on September 27th, next week on Wednesday, that safe banking vote is going to be scheduled for a committee vote in the Senate. Do you think that with the Schedule 3 recommendation and HHS movement and now the DEA signing off, do you think that this kind of gives it more teeth this time around? Do you think that kind of increases the odds that we get some sort of banking reform?
Well, I mean, just to be clear, the DEA has not signed off yet.
No, I meant signing off potentially over the next couple of months.
Yeah, well, I mean, assuming that they sign off on it at all. I do not think it's going to be in the next couple of months. I think it's going to be a much longer process than that. And if we look at history, but and I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's going to be a lot of people that maybe have taken a bath in the past on their investments because they were thinking that like a little bit of movement or promises from lawmakers was going to result in a change. Best bets are engaging in some wishful thinking now that this time around is absolutely going to happen without just recognizing that anything can happen. Politics is the art of the possible. And right now, what is possible is a lot more than what has been in the past, but nothing is for certain.
Right.
That being said, I think it's possible that, the recent news from HHS could be raising, or it's definitely raising the profile of cannabis policy reform issues, and it could be spurring the Senate to try to move more quickly in order to get something done in anticipation of this. But I think that the real driver of it is the fact that the sponsors of this legislation, the primary champions of this issue in the Senate have always been Jeff Merkley and Steve Daines. They have been working their butts off to deal with any of the issues and concerns that members of the Senate Banking Committee, as well as their broader Senate compatriots and in their respective caucuses, and have really put in serious legwork to address those concerns and come up with a compromise that is acceptable to the greatest number of lawmakers. So their contribution and leadership on this just cannot be overstated.
Oh, that's a good point. We definitely appreciate their leadership and all the efforts, even if they're not on board with full blown federal legalization. Like I say, we need people to kind of step up to the plate, and definitely kudos goes out to them. And then real quickly, I had a lot of people asking, how could we potentially see multi-state operators in the U.S. uplist to major exchanges like the NYSE and the NASDAQ? Do you have any thoughts on this personally? Would you expect, could it be through some sort of rescheduling? Could it be through safe banking? What do you think is the most likely scenario that could kind of pave the way for that to happen?
So I don't think that it's necessarily going to be a free-for-all if safe banking passes. Honestly, I don't think that it would be really that big of an impact at all. Neither do I think rescheduling would have that big of an impact in terms of being able to have more access to public trading and things like that. Right. Honestly, I think descheduling is really the only way that we're going to be able to effectively do that without there being still a whole lot of strings attached and reputational risk issues with various service providers and various financial institutions. Even if SAFER passes, I think that we're still going to see a lot of the bigger financial institutions avoiding the issue because cannabis is still a Schedule I substance, and even if it moves to Schedule III, it's still in this gray area, unlike any other Schedule III substance, which creates a lot of inherent or perceived risk on the part of some of these larger operators who tend to be much more risk averse in the financial services industry and the larger financial environment, not necessarily in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, and they could face, companies could face litigation, that type of thing. They have fiduciary duties. They have shareholders to adhere to, right? So if something's on a Schedule I or even Schedule III, what sort of image does that portray, right? So, I like you say, it could be a long time before we even get sign off from the DEA or any kind of movement there. What do you think the chances are they just skip rescheduling, and they deschedule it altogether and treat it like tobacco and alcohol? What do you think?
The DEA?
Yeah.
Practically zero.
Practically zero.
I mean, just as late as 2016, they were adamant about keeping cannabis in Schedule I. So doing a complete reversal like that in such a short span of time is completely unprecedented.
Okay.
I mean, gotcha. I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. That would be amazing. But I don't see it happening.
Wishful thinking for sure. And then you mentioned next year, obviously being an election year in the U.S. How important do you think what sort of a role do you think cannabis is going to play in those election campaigns? And how do you think pro candidates are going to be able to get a lot more votes? How much, like I said, how big of a factor do you think it's going to play in the 2024 elections?
Well, the science around how cannabis impacts elections is still pretty muddy. I honestly wish that there was a lot more research done on this. But the impact on cannabis from being put on an election, a presidential election year, is pretty well understood. Presidential election years always tend to bring out voters that are generally more supportive of cannabis policy reform, particularly younger voters of either party. You know, we see that there are majorities in the U.S. Of both sides of the aisle that support legalizing cannabis. Lesser for conservatives than for liberals and for independents, but what we see is that there's always a lot more turnout among younger and more progressive voters who are more likely to support cannabis policy reform and more likely to consider that in their determinations for who they vote for any particular office than we see in off-year elections. And that's one of the reasons why opponents of legalization have been resorting to lawsuits and various delay tactics to make sure that state level ballot initiatives are put on off year or midterm elections instead of in presidential elections, because they know that they stand a worse chance of being successful if they're not on presidential election years. That's not to say that they are not successful. We've seen in state after state during off-year elections that they have been able to pass, but it's more difficult to get them across the finish line. And I think this is also indicative of legalization opponents' larger strategy and a realization that they have failed and will continue to fail to win over the hearts and minds of American voters. And so the only resource or recourse that they have is to try to limit the impact of those voters in any given scenario, whether that's making sure that a ballot initiative is on an off-year election, or trying to raise the qualifying number of signatures to get on a ballot, or raise the number of votes something needs to actually be considered successful and be implemented. We're seeing this around the country because our opponents have been able to or have not been able to win the scientific or the moral argument.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of leads me, that was a good segue into my next point, actually. So you mentioned the ballot, like Florida, I think the Supreme Court still has to sign off on it, but Florida could potentially be on the ballot for 2024 full-blown adult use. How important do you think the Florida market's going to be, sort of in the race to getting, reform in the US, specifically at the federal level, in terms of full-blown federal legalization?
Well, I mean, Florida is certainly important. There are a number of lawmakers from Florida that I think would potentially alter their position on this issue at the federal level if their constituents are living in an adult use state as opposed to just a medical state. But honestly, and Florida is another example of where the establishment is trying to keep it off the ballot, as opposed to letting the voters decide. And Florida already has a 60% threshold for approving ballot measures, which is pretty difficult to pass. It has stopped medical initiatives from being passed in previous years. And but I'm honestly really looking forward to the Ohio initiative coming up this fall.
Yep.
Ohio has a very robust medical program. The initiative is very well written, much better than the 2015 initiative. And the people that are running it are real professionals and aren't going to send around a mascot in like a Doug costume.
Awesome. Well, you've just been basically picking off my next questions one after the other. That was my next question. What other states are you excited about, or what other states could we keep on our radar to expect, from either medical or adult use, some movement in 2024?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to keep harping on Ohio, even though it's a fairly conservative state in terms of its state legislature, the voters are very solidly behind this initiative. And it's crafted specifically to focus on initial licensing benefiting social equity applicants. It's allows existing medical operators to be able to transition into the adult use market before additional licenses are granted beyond the social equity licenses that are going to be initially granted. It allows home cultivation. It's a great initiative, and I think that it really has the juice to be able to pass coming up in November here. As of right now, most of the legislative sessions are completely done, but there are a number of states that we've seen cannabis policy reform legislation get pretty close, but not quite. We're talking about like the Carolinas. In places like Tennessee, we expect to see medical legislation, or at least more robust medical legislation. There's, I think we're going to see a lot of bills related to cannabis policy be introduced in the coming state sessions, and you can definitely keep track of them at NORML's website. We do our best to be able to track every single bill that is coming down the pipe in various states, and try to inform our members about whether or not we support them and what they can do if they want to support those pieces of legislation. But I mean, we're looking at a situation now where every single state legislative session that comes up nationally, there are hundreds of cannabis policy reform bills being introduced, and a lot of them are getting pretty close. We're also seeing improvement bills on things like, everything from, fixing tax rates to expanding access to, things like funding expungement efforts, or removing the smell of cannabis as probable cause to search somebody's car. There are just like so many incremental legislation that are going to be really important for cannabis consumers, and that by extension directly impact and benefit the industry as well.
Right. And something else we cover a lot on the channel is like Web3 and crypto. And I know a lot of, there's been a lot of crypto bills going through, like stable coins and things like that. So it's even entirely possible, leading into the election year here next year, that kind of, the kind of crypto steals the show, I guess, takes the thunder away a little bit. But I would expect that we're probably more or less going to get some sort of stablecoin legislation or some sort of movement on Congress over the next couple of years, specifically over the next year for sure, with regards to crypto. And then, I would think that maybe, in the following elections after that, another 4 years, that could be, MJ's time to shine. Hopefully.
Well, I think we're going to see a lot of movement at the state level every single year going forward.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Hopefully, like I say, just keep moving forward, and even if it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as long as we're moving forward, that's the main thing.
And that's been the history of cannabis policy reform in this country, and it definitely makes it challenging to work in this field. But so you have to have a very thick skin and be able to handle disappointment, which I think is something that is also a valuable lesson for investors.
But on the flip side of that, it makes it that much more worthwhile too whenever you do get something done, right? Way more, right? So just feel way more satisfied, I guess.
Yeah, they're all hard battles, and when you get a win, it's definitely okay to feel real good about it.
Yeah. Well, even Don Murphy,
we're fighting hundreds of years of prohibition, or 100 years of prohibition. So,
yep. Well, even Don Murphy yesterday, you could hear the excitement in his voice, right? It just kind of almost he sounded like exhausted. It's like, oh my God, this took forever, but also relieved at the same time. So that was great to see. And then wrapping up here, what are your thoughts on the U.S. legalizing at the federal level, like legalizing medical? Do you think that would happen in the not too distant future, or would it be more or less just left up to each individual state, in your opinion?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the HHS letter to DEA is the tacit admission that cannabis does have medical uses, because they're trying to move it out of Schedule I, defined as high potential for abuse, no accepted medical uses. In terms of legislation allowing like just medical programs, we're really not seeing anything coming down the pipe that specifically addresses that. We're seeing more incremental legislation, such as allowing VA doctors to be able to recommend medical cannabis, removing barriers to research, creating partnerships between states and universities to be able to increase study capacity. But when cannabis is descheduled, it's still going to be up to states to determine these policies.
Right.
So, even if the bill were to pass, that has yet to be introduced, that explicitly legalizes cannabis for medical use, then it would still have to go through the FDA process to be a medicine, and individual states would still have to pass medical laws, even though there's only really 13 that don't have what we would consider to be effective medical cannabis laws left.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Well, that's always great insight as always. And then in terms of, kind of backing away from the US market, any updates on your international charters?
Well, we just got covered this week by a gentleman in Luxembourg who's trying to there. That international is an area that unfortunately we don't have as many chapters as we used to. I think that's largely a factor of bandwidth and resources. That being said, it's something that I am personally committed to, because we are starting to see, the U.S. as the major exporter of the drug war around the world. We have kind of a moral imperative to help our brothers and sisters and everybody in between in other countries to try to help them overcome policies that in many cases were supported or imposed by the U.S. Via fiat. And, so I want to see a lot more international action, a lot more cooperation between folks in the U.S. and Canada and folks outside of the U.S. To try to provide as many resources and educational materials as possible. One thing that I always have to think about in the back of my mind, though, is that there are still a lot of places in this world where activism can be legally punished, where talking about cannabis or trying to promote cannabis can be legally punished, where possession of cannabis can still get you the death penalty. So whenever I'm working with international partners, I always have to think in the back of my mind of I have to be careful not to juice people up too much to a position where they might be putting themselves in danger of imprisonment or worse. So I think that anybody out there that's interested in getting involved in international activism and partnering with other advocates outside of the U.S. and Canada, always keep that in the back of your mind. But I do think that it's very, very worthwhile for us to be able to provide as many resources and information as possible to folks that are starting these fledgling efforts.
Absolutely. Just giving them the information and the education, right? And then get the ball rolling. And like you say, I mention it all the time in my videos that, so there's, like I said, people just getting frustrated with the lack of movement in the space, whether it be from a price point standpoint of stocks or just, from reform at the federal level or at the government and state level. But like you say, you have to remember that there's still certain, Singapore will sentence you to death if you have any more than 30 grams on you, right? So it's going to take a long time before we, and maybe there'll be some countries that never allow it. To your point, it's really is a juggling act at, whenever you're dealing with international charters. And then we have Germany set to come online potentially here in the next few months. And then that should be a nice, kind of game theory domino effect playing out for the rest of the EU. And then, as we know, the US is never usually first, but they're never last. And usually we see, the EU and then, Canada and then the US move last. But I mean, they should be able to leapfrog most other markets as well, just because of their sheer, economic impact.
Yeah, so, and there are a number of treaty issues involved as well, but so far we haven't seen any real serious substantive backlash against countries that were signatories to the 1961 Single Convention that have gone ahead and legalized cannabis for adults, Canada being a perfect example. And I think exactly to your point, every single country outside of the United States that legalizes cannabis gives us a little bit more ammunition to use with U.S. lawmakers and other public officials to show them hey, look, this is where the direction that the entire planet is moving in. And right now, the United States is being lapped by the rest of the world.
100%. Yeah. And yeah, they're just kind of losing out on the opportunity. And like I said, I think it's sort of, on a back burner to a certain extent because they're just, well, for lack of a better word, kind of cocky when you think about it. The same thing with crypto. You see a lot of offshore companies moving offshore, going to other markets where they have clear rules of the road. It's very ambiguous and Congress is very slow to act. And it's just kind of a sign of the times, right? It just goes to show you that, they're never usually people to embrace it first. But again, I think I can go back to that word, using it again, is that they kind of have the right to be a little cocky, right? They have the biggest economy in the world, and they can have such an economic impact that whenever they do embrace something, they'll just be at the front of the pack in very short order, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And nobody in Congress wants to get left behind by anybody else.
100%, yeah. So like you said, it's positive overall, and well, that's pretty much everything that I had. What can people do, to our viewers and listeners that are going to be viewing this after I make it live? What can they do to support NORML and the cannabis industry at large?
First and foremost, you can contact your lawmakers by going to norml.org/act. You can also go to norml.org/support to find ways to not only start NORML chapters in your locality, wherever that may be, but also ways to help the organization continue its goals, both domestically within the United States as well as abroad, through various forms of donation, either directly cash or things like crypto or stock donations, or putting us in your will, things like that. More and more nonprofits, and NORML has traditionally relied upon small dollar donors, and I think that as philanthropic money and as industry money that is completely focused on advocacy, especially for consumer advocacy, has somewhat dried up over the last decade. It's really vital for consumers and people that care about consumers and people that care about the future of this industry in a larger and more long-term sense to help support our efforts however you can.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I definitely encourage people to reach out. Obviously, I'm in Canada. We're blue today, just in support of the Dems in office. They said they were going to do stuff. They said they were going to move along some sort of MJ reform. So here's my tribute to them to get something done. Obviously, I'm not on any side of the aisle. This isn't political. I'm from Canada, so I literally could care less. All I want is who's going to be the best for this industry. What party is going to move the needle and get things past the finish line. And I've donated to NORML in the past, but like you said, you can go to norml.org and then click on the donate button. You can donate. I've done it in the past, and I'll continue to do so to support the cause. But any closing remarks, Morgan, before we close it up?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but really appreciate your support, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Absolutely. I was looking forward to it all day. So again, always a pleasure speaking with you. And thanks again for doing this, Morgan. Looking forward to our next chat.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Awesome. Keep up the great work. Take care.